please use *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute yourself. And as you've just been notified, the meeting will be recorded and available on our website after this workshop. So we will follow our usual procedure where Harrison will count the sub-basin committee members present in this meeting and then let us know if any of the sub-basin committees have a quorum, which means that they will be indeed having a meeting. And so we will just take a quick break at some point after he's taken account of who's present to let us know if any of the sub-basins have a quorum. The next item on our agenda is public comments on items that are on the agenda, because this is a special meeting. Before we do open it up for public comments, I will note that we do have a significant portion of our time dedicated to questions for items on the agenda during our presentation. So with that, I will open it up for public comments.
Not seeing any raised hands at this time, Emily.
Okay, so we will get straight to item 4. Okay, so as I mentioned, we will have about 25% of our time today allocated for questions. So we have a lot of material to move through, so we will ask for questions and comments during the scheduled times that I'm outlining here. We'll also pause and ask for questions periodically. We'll be using a timer, and we'll limit the comments and questions to 2 minutes. And we'll begin to also address the questions that were submitted prior to the workshop during our question and answer periods. In addition to raising your hand for the comments, please also feel free to use the chat function to submit questions so we can try to consolidate the topics when applicable. And we'll just try to get to as many questions as possible. Not sure how many there are going to be today. So we have a great team present today to both present topics and also answer questions, including Dr. Wes Henson from the USGS, Howard Franklin from the Monterey County Water Resource Agency, Derek Williams, Stefan Shore, and Gregory Nelson with Montgomery and Associates, and Matt Bailey with the Wood Group. Howard Franklin will be helping facilitating the question and answer portions of the workshop. And I'm going to pass it over to Derek Williams now, who will introduce what we're going to be covering today.
I am now not muted. Thank you very much, Emily. Okay, so I am going to give just a quick welcome and an overview to sort of set the stage and get everybody thinking in the right direction. If I could just have the next slide. Where we're going today is we want to talk about the purpose of the Salinas Valley Integrated Hydrologic Model. I'm going to be talking about that the most. That's where I'm going to come in. And then we're going to, after that, provide a technical overview. How does the model work? What is going to be informative to you as stakeholders of how the model works? And Dr. Henson will be talking about quite a bit of that then. And we will then wrap it up talking about how the model will be used for Salinas Valley water management in general, but for GSP development in particular. And as you'll find out, this is a model that is part of a long history of modeling and will be a long future of modeling that is used for all sorts of Salinas Valley water management. But the one we're most concerned about right now is the GSP. We are going to provide as many opportunities as we can for questions there, hopefully be able to get to all of them there. We have already received some in writing and we'll get to those fairly soon. So next slide, please. I want to set the stage about groundwater models. What are they and why do hydrologists model? And I want to set this because when people hear the word groundwater, the model, different people have different views of what they should be. So I'm going to give you my view and kind of a standard hydrogeologist view of what a groundwater model is and how it is used, hopefully to get everybody who's on this meeting thinking in the same direction about what to expect out of a model and what to expect out of these models in particular. Most importantly, models are tools to help make decisions. Models are not reality. They, to some degree, are just a estimate of reality, and to some degree, they are really just tools that help make decisions there. So that's the way you should be thinking. That's probably the most important thing I'm going to be saying today, is that we aren't necessarily trying to reproduce everything in the subsurface. We are trying to come up with a tool that helps us guide us for our decisions. Now, to build that tool, we take accepted scientific principles about groundwater flow, about recharge, about stream flow. We take those principles and we put all these data into the tool. And what this tool does, one of the greatest things it does is it coordinates all those data. It takes a lot of different types of data, puts them together, coordinates them, and analyzes them. And by saying we've taken all these data and got all the data to be coordinated and add up correctly in the right way, we get to a point where we say, this tool gives us information, informative information, that allows us to make decisions with confidence because we don't have that much uncertainty. And that's really what models do. We could make decisions without the model, and we would have a lot of uncertainty in our decisions. The very point of having a model is to reduce the uncertainty and have confidence in our decisions. So when everything you hear about today, you should be thinking about, I see how they're doing that to reduce the uncertainty in our decisions and to add some confidence in where we're going. That's the whole point of it. Next slide, please. So in order to get that confidence, we approximate subsurface conditions in groundwater models. The problem is, and we use those subsurface conditions to guide how the models are built. So we have some information about subsurface conditions, and we say, well, let's try and approximate what that looks like in the subsurface, so we have confidence that we are estimating things correctly. One thing you should keep in mind, we have imperfect knowledge of the subsurface conditions. In some places, we have very poor knowledge of the subsurface conditions. Therefore, and that's why I underlined and highlighted approximate. What we're doing is taking the data that we can feel confident about in the subsurface and putting it in the model. But the model does not duplicate the subsurface. It is guided by the subsurface in order to give us some confidence in our predictions here. And that's something that some people kind of forget about. Our job is not to duplicate the subsurface. It's to develop a tool based on what we know about the subsurface that gives us confidence there. The other thing you should know about what is a model, they do not make decisions. They guide our decisions, but we still have to make the decisions. The best analogy I heard was from Jason Smith, who realized groundwater models are like weather prediction models. They have some inaccuracy. They're good for what's going to happen tomorrow. They get a little worse as you look farther and farther into the future, and they aren't guaranteed, but they do guide what we do. They do guide whether we're going to take an umbrella with us today. And so that's the way you should think of these models, kind of the same as weather models, have the same level of confidence in them and the same level of question about them. Next slide, please. So the last point I want to make, models have purposes. Models are not good for everything. They are done for specific purposes. And one of the things about that is it depends on what area you're looking at. Some models are made for city blocks or contaminant plumes, like you see on the far right on this slide. Some are for groundwater basins, some are for larger. The one that I'm showing in the middle covers the entire eastern half of the United States there. I don't know what it's good for, but it is a groundwater model that covers the entire eastern half of the United States. Because of that, every model has a purpose and a scale that it should answer questions for. The current one is to develop integrated groundwater surface water management options for the Salinas Valley. That's the purpose of this model. It is not appropriate for individual parcels. And that's a question we received already, and I want to answer that question. This is a valley-wide model that looks at how do we manage our integrated water in the valley. So next slide. That's the take-home message here. What we're going to be talking about is a tool. It's not a duplication of the subsurface. It's a tool that is supported by best available data, and it guides our valley-wide decisions. That's where we want to go with that. Next slide, please. I think at this point we are going to hand this over to Howard Franklin, and Howard's going to give a background on the history of groundwater modeling in the Salinas Valley, give a little context for how we got to where we are.
Eric, so I just want to take a few minutes to talk to you about the recent history of model development and use in the Salinas Valley. Going back to the late 1970s and continuing today, a number of groundwater and surface water models have been developed for the basin, and I've highlighted some of them here. Those include the 1978 USGS release of what has come to known as the Durbin model. It was a finite element model of the basin used to formulate plans for managing water resources of the area. That was its stated purpose. Then in 1986, Boyle Engineering's Young Yoon developed a proprietary model known as the FEGW-14, which was a predecessor to our IGSM or SVIGSM model, which we're going to talk a little bit more about later. And again, in 1988, Eugene Yates of the USGS completed what was described as a major revision of the Durbin model, or the 78 Durbin model, whose purpose was to identify and quantify the various types of flow into and out of the groundwater basin and to describe the physical processes that control them. So all these models do basically the same thing. They solve the groundwater flow equation. And I've used these examples because the developers of these models, Durbin, Yoon, and Yates, represent a top tier of model developers that have worked here in the basin. Added to that list would be Dr. Ali Tagabi, who was the primary developer of the SVIGSM, and now Dr. Wesley Hinson of the USGS, who's currently working on the development of the SVIHM and SVOM. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to take a moment to talk a little more about the Salinas Valley Integrated Groundwater and Surface Water Model. In 1990, the agency began the development and the use of the SVIGSM, and that relationship with the IGSM lasted over 17 years. And here are a few quick highlights that are bulleted here, with the beginning of the configuration of the model, the use of the model in 1998 for the historical benefits analysis, updated again in 2000 to include an Arroyo Seco analysis for the historical benefits analysis. And of note in this list is that the Salinas Valley Water Project, for example, from initial model development to application, was a process that took almost a decade. Next slide, please. So where are we today? Development of the SVIHM began in 2015 when the USGS was engaged by the County of Monterey to create a tool to evaluate the water supply of the agency's Zone 2C. After the initial calibration of the historical model was completed, the agency and our consultants began working with the USGS to begin the development of an associated operational model. Next slide, please. So both the SVIHM and SVOM have been and are being used provisionally for several projects. And you're going to hear more about these models here in just a few minutes, but going over a few of the projects that the SVIHM and OM have been used for include the county's basin investigation, the USBR, USGS, and other local partners, Salinas and Carmel Basin study, which is going to take a look at climate and water supply vulnerability out to the year 2100. Of course, the groundwater sustainability plans of the SVBGSA, the Water Resources Agency Interlake Tunnel, and winter release modeling that Monterey County Water Resource Agency did to evaluate options for releases from our reservoirs. And we're anticipating the continued refinement and use of these models for years to come. Emily? So before I move on, I want to mention that we've received some general questions on what the workshop will address and some specific technical questions on the model capabilities. Responses to those questions will be covered within this presentation, and where appropriate, as Mr. Williams has already done, the presenters will highlight those responses. But now we're going to move forward on the agenda with an introduction of the ModFlow model by Dr. Wesley Hinson of the USGS. Wes?
Helps to be unmuted. Yes, just one moment while I share my screen and navigate that quick transition. All right. So I wanted to give an introduction of the software that's driving all of these modeling tools, so that we have a background on some of those. These are all published documents that there's a wide wealth of data, and I have links to the data there that you can reference for more information about all of these tools. And here I'm highlighting the specific things relevant to answering both the questions that were made ahead of time, as well as some of the things that I often get as other questions from other citizens as we're interacting with different groups. So the first is ModFlow OWHM. It's a one water hydrologic model. And the idea behind this model is that it combines a USGS groundwater model called ModFlow with a supply and demand framework and a crop model and a climate model together to create a integrated modeling tool to help understand kind of the interactions between surface and groundwater, and then also the management and other kind of societal constraints that we have on diversions and water rights and other kinds of things that are constraining the natural system. Here's a link at the very top of the page for the software. If you want to read the report or download it for additional information, I would direct you there. But the important part about this is we think about this as kind of like an onion, right? So at the core of this onion, you have a diversion and pumping and this landscape water demand. So that's for both native and for cultivated lands. And we have a demand for water in order to meet that particular land use or vegetation's needs for water. Now, layered on top of that, we have the kind of the hydrologic system. So we have stream flow and the storage in the aquifer, and there's the exchanges between them that are expressed here in this gray. And there's a lot of interactions among these components. That's what all these arrows are just trying to indicate, is that the landscape demands, especially when we're diverting or extracting water from the system, will influence the groundwater water levels, otherwise known as groundwater head, or the amount of groundwater flow or discharge to streams, and as well as the seepage from surface water to groundwater and the flows in the river. So it's a very tightly compared system, and the advantage of this approach is that we are considering all these major pieces that interact with each other at the same time. So if that wasn't complicated enough, right, we have the human system, the management and allocation system that is layered on top of that. And so we have surface water allocations, so diversion rights, the amount of storage or access you have to particular storage or pipelines or reclaimed water, basically all of those kinds of water sources that you have available to meet the demands within the system. And then you also have all of the constraints on the groundwater system. So water rights, constraints on pumping rates. And the idea here is that we simulate everything from the ground surface, so all the surface processes for agriculture and climate, all the way through the groundwater system. And so we actually and layer on the human connections and the human management strategies, all within one framework. On the bottom part, so the subsurface, is the widely used groundwater model ModFlow. You may be familiar with it. It's been around for a very long time. And here's, again, a few more references in case you want to delve deeper on your own. But it's a modular program that simulates the major important processes that affect groundwater budgets. So streams, lakes, aquifers, and wells. And then layered on that is this crop model called the farm process. And that is a kind of integrates how the surface boundary is feeding into the groundwater. So how the water is being recharged, how the water is being extracted. You know, it's what's simulating what has to happen within the system to meet the demands for different land uses. And here, this graphic is just showing kind of how this fits into the world. So from every arrow above this groundwater box right here is the parts of this that are handled by the farm process. So we have a land use where rain and irrigation are applied to it. A portion of that irrigation ends up as recharge, and a portion of that irrigation is returned as runoff. And then there's a large portion of that irrigation or rain is actually vented back to the atmosphere as evapotranspiration from both plants and surfaces. A big concept to understand here that's very important to grasp is the idea of a water balance region. In order to better correlate regional constraints and regional water rights, we kind of discretize the surface into groups of cells that have a common water source, so that we can do a water balance on every one of those zones. So just even though these zones are defined, they're just done for the purpose of driving how we distribute and meet demands. Every cell in the model is still an independent model cell. So referring back to one of the questions about how do subbasins interact with each other and what do they do with the river and return flows, every model cell is solved independently, but the groups of these cells are put together into these water balance regions. So we can say that some of these areas have access to pipelines and some areas don't. Some areas, like this vegetation area here, is just pulling from just shallow groundwater because it doesn't have, you're not going to pump to meet the demands of riparian trees. And then you have other areas where you have more complex access to irrigation or reservoir systems. And so it just allows you to specify what sources of water each area has and solve a water balance on each area. So again, transpiration is simulated throughout the model. Recharge, you can do dryland agriculture. These regions, while they are fixed in time to meet the current, more aligned with the jurisdictional boundaries within the Salinas Valley model, these can change in time if need be. So if there is a need to evaluate or group different regions of the model, that can be done very easily. We can also simulate the farm demands for every irrigation, recycled water, groundwater pumpage from single and multi-screened aquifer wells, return flows from drains and actually into rivers and canals, and then also put constraints on all of these so that we can limit the available water to the water right. And again, just furthering explaining this water balance subregion, you establish a supply and demand framework for every land use in every cell. So multiple land uses can exist in every model cell. The model cells are about 6 acres in dimension. And water demand is calculated for the land use in each cell. The groups of cells are aggregated into regions with a common water supply, called a water balance subregion. Or a WBS, which is how you'll see it abbreviated throughout this whole presentation. And water demands then are computed for each land use in each cell. And then the available water supplies for each water balance subregion are used to meet the demands for all cells within the water balance subregion. So we're not pumping one well to meet one cell's land use needs, or what all needs are met from every well, and it's distributed across all the wells. And this is another reason why this is a a great tool for understanding, sub-regional to regional scale water management questions, and why maybe a parcel-based approach would not be as appropriate to use this, because you're not pumping the actual values necessarily from every well that may have been pumped from that well. You're distributing all of the pumping across all of the available wells to meet the regional needs for water. This is also another way of aggregating the behaviors of a community so that the community can understand what they're doing together as a whole and work together to find solutions on how to address any sort of water supply needs. These water balance regions are simulated with considering all of the natural inputs of water as well. So you have natural precipitation is considered in this process. So first prioritized order of how the demands are satisfied for every land use and every cell is that the precipitation is used first, and then any shallow groundwater that's available in the root zone. Then any surface water diversions are used. Then any recycled water or other available pipeline water or any other kind of produced water sources that are kind of like a tank, as you can envision them that way. And then any of the groundwater wells that are linked with that water balance subregion. After all of the demands are met, so meaning you use all of these water sources to meet the demands, the excess water is then partitioned into both the recharge and runoff term for each land use in each cell. That recharge goes into the subsurface, and then the runoff is actually added to all the streams within the water balance subregion, using a relationship between the length of the streams in every one of the stream reaches. Therefore, each water balance subregion is distinct for the supply and demand calculations, but each cell in a water balance subregion is part of the entire hydrologic model. So there's really two scales at which all outputs of the model are available. It's just a aggregation method that we use to help drive and fairly distribute water supply to meet the demands within such a large basin that has a lot of variety in its production and in its in the crop types and et cetera throughout the domain. So how do we actually simulate what the water needs are for every land use in every cell? Well, we start off with understanding what the potential of evapotranspiration is. And there are many methods to do that. I won't dive into them here, but it's basically defining a potential energy, a maximum amount of water that could be used by all of the plants and vegetation in the area and all the bare surfaces that also may have evaporation from them. To establish this potential, we use well-known and well-established methods to use climate data. So from the CMIS stations, NOAA climate stations, weather stations at airports, basically every climate station data with a time series of data that we can use to inform information, along with longer term data. We develop these kind of maps of potential evapotranspiration for every month. And on the left is just a picture real quickly of what a climate station looks like. And then that second image is how we take the potential evapotranspiration estimates and develop them from the kind of coarse scale that they initially come out of most climate tools. And we actually scale them down so that they have a much more relative scale to the model grid size. And then this information is used as a basis for determining the maximum amount of water that could be asked for in each month. Now, the crop areas, we take those from available land use data and from a land use data method that I'll explain in the next section of this workshop. And then we take the crop properties from literature, field studies, and previously calibrated models in the region. Those two pieces of information are fed into a crop model. We use an adapted version of the Food and Agricultural Organizations, it's the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO 56 bulletin method. And this uses what's called a crop coefficient. And what this crop coefficient does is it represents how the demand of a particular crop changes as it moves through its growth cycle. There's an initial period that's as the crop is just beginning going. There's a transitional period that is as the crop is obtaining its growth between initial planting and harvest. There's a harvesting stage and then a senescent stage. So there's a kind of a cycle to how all these plants ask for water, and all of those cycles are embedded for every land use type in the model. So that's great. That tells you how much water, this crop coefficient method can tell you how much water a plant would need to meet its maximum development. But we need to get out, what does that actually mean for actually pumping or for diversions? How do we actually assess that part? So we establish a consumptive use, and that's based on the area of each crop, that potential evapotranspiration, and this crop coefficient. And this is the amount of water in perfect efficiency that would be needed to be delivered to a cell to meet the water needs for that one specific land use type. Now, where available, we actually use the reported pumping, reported diversions to guide, evaluate, and calibrate the simulated agricultural demand. So we're using the data, that stakeholder-driven reported data to really enhance our understanding, and because there are a lot of things that you can, a lot of parameters that can vary within a certain range of values. And this information from the reported pumpage and reported diversions is a great way of helping constrain and understand whether those properties are representing the reported demands. Altogether, this creates an agricultural applied water estimate that we feed into the model, and then we use that information to meet this water need from all available water sources. And pointing back to a couple of questions back in the beginning that were presented from stakeholders ahead of this meeting, is the understanding of the difference between a water balance and what's available by subregion and what's available by cell. And I wanted to clearly give an enumeration here of what's available on a cell by cell basis and what's available in the water balance subregion. And the answer is all outputs are available on a cell by cell basis and by a stream reach by stream reach basis. Some outputs are aggregated for convenience to make it easier to understand how groups of areas behave together. So within the subsurface and in the stream channel, everything is computed for every cell. So anywhere in the model can be readily quantified. That's for stream infiltration and discharge, runoff, pumping, recharge, underflow, and then lateral and vertical aquifer exchanges. And these cell by cell flows are aggregated in several output budget files. For water balance subregions, the outputs again are aggregated just for convenience to be able to understand what's going on in groups of areas, because this is a regional scale model that is looking at sub-regional areas to understand holistically the Salinas Valley. So every land surface non-stream flow, so everything that's not a cell that contains a stream in it, is computed with using the balances within the water balance subregion. The supply and demand data are computed for each cell, for each land use, and then the agricultural supply, demand, consumptive use, evapotranspiration, and recharge are distributed to all of the cells within that water balance subregion. And then those data are reported in specific water balance subregion data in farm process budget output files. So there's a couple specific files that provide information that are aggregated to these sub areas for further information. However, some additional files can be written out by the model that will provide information on a crop by crop basis, as well as a cell by cell basis to facilitate other analyses as they're appropriate. So I wanted to touch here on these questions to see where some of these may have been answered in the presentation about the modeling tools themselves. And the first here is that, we want to make sure that we fully cover the understanding between what a subbasin is, what a water balance subregion is, and how that relates, and what the connectivity and interaction among these units are. And that's one of the goals of this previous 10 minutes, was to try and address that. And I welcome any questions about that in just a moment. Also, we want to account for irrigation water. So while we can provide a data for every single cell in the model, because demands are spread out across the entire water balance subregion, it's not necessarily appropriate to look at the return flows for one single parcel of land, because we're really aggregating behaviors across an entire sub area. For the submitted questions were specific to the Salinas Valley Integrated Hydrologic Model, will be handled as we discuss the Integrated Hydrologic Model after the break. And the operational model will be the same, and we'll address that in the operational model presentation. I think the remaining questions are model specific, so I believe that we can move on to the next to our break. Pass it back to Emily to facilitate, or Howard to facilitate that next section.
Thank you, Wes. So we're going to take a few minutes here if you have any questions. I know a lot of material has already been put in front of you, and we have quite a bit more to go. I'm going to reach out to Harry. Are you seeing any hands raised, or are there any questions coming from the group? And if not, we'll move right on into the next section.
All right, Howard, we do have one hand raised from Justine Massey.
Sure.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can, Justine. How are you?
Great. Thanks. I'm doing well. How are you?
Good.
Thank you for providing so much information on the model. I just wanted to make sure I understood how this part that was just presented fits in to the integrated model. Is this like a slice of one of the layers that's in the model, or is this a separate piece? Somehow I didn't quite follow that. And relatedly, I noticed that there are there's no representation of domestic water use in the model that was presented so far. And I was just wondering if like the available water factors in domestic use, has that been subtracted out beforehand, or how is that handled? Thank you.
Sure, I'll address those questions for you, Justine. First off, I think Dr. Hinson gave us a pretty good overview of the entirety of the ModFlow model and other related models that in its entirety represent the integrated groundwater model. With regard to urban pumping, yes, urban pumping is captured as part of the water balance, and it is represented in the model. It just wasn't pulled out specifically in Dr. Hinson's presentation.
Great, that's what I figured. Just wanted to make sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a few more hands now. The next is George Fontes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Fontes.
George, I've asked you to unmute, if you could do that on your end.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hinson mentioned natural and artificial recharge. And just for clarification, is the artificial recharge would be the interaction of the dams?
So I think Dr. Hinson was presenting the capabilities of the model to be able to capture artificial or natural recharge. We haven't characterized within this model specifically releases from the dam as artificial recharge, yet reservoir operations and water released and the reason for water release from the reservoirs are captured within the model.
Okay, so the model is capable of modeling the aquifers with and without the reservoirs?
Yes, it is.
Thank you.
Clarification, if it were configured that way. Another question?
Yeah, next we have Bill Light.
Hello, Mr. Light.
Bill, I've asked you to unmute. Press *6.
So I think at this point, I'm going to ask the remaining attendees with questions to please submit them within the comments. We'd like to move on. We have a lot of material yet to present, so we will get to your questions. Please let us help us capture them by your comments. So with that, Emily, I'll return the presentation to you, and we're moving on now to talk a bit about the construction and calibration of the SVIHM. I believe that's you again, Dr. Hinson.
One. All right, so we've done a lot of work here to really simulate this really complicated and wonderfully interesting system, and want to provide some information about how that was set up. First, I want to provide a little bit of some of the terms you might see and also provide as a reference. So if you refer back to this presentation later or to the printed version, you'll have a little bit of an overview of the lexicon. We had used the California Pesticide Use Reporting Database is used to help enhance the land use data information, the Modflow One Water hydrological model, which I just described. There's the farm process, which is, you'll see abbreviated as FMP. The water balance subregion, again, you'll see that abbreviated as WBS. The surface water operations module, and that's what simulates the reservoirs in the operational model, the SVOM. And then in natural cliff, you may see that as well. Salinas Valley Model Suite is a collection of models that we've been building that all feed into this framework. So it's not just a single model. It's a wealth of models that have been developed together and linked together to provide a holistic understanding of the water balance from the atmosphere all the way through the aquifer. You have a basin characteristics model, which is the climate model, a geologic model, which was used to develop the structures and layering, the watershed model, the Salinas Valley watershed model, which does rainfall and runoff processes for the entire watershed. The integrated hydrologic model, which integrates the data from all of those previous models into a single framework. And then the Salinas Valley operational model, which is a baseline model that inherits a lot of information from the Salinas model and integrates it, but adds the surface water operations component to that to dynamically simulate the reservoir and to look at different alternatives for how operations could. We've received a substantial input from stakeholders and technical advisors. We have 8 technical advisory committees over 2 years, stakeholder surveys and 11 meetings. And then we did consultations with local national agricultural experts, and of course, the Groundwater Sustainability Agency. Again, this is not just a single model. It's built from many sub-models that are all linked together into an entire framework. And every one of these pieces is its own model with its own components that are a piece of each of them. And I'm not going to enumerate every subcomponent, which is every one of these models is actually a model of models. we get into this framework where there's just a lot of information going into this that have really been driven by stakeholder information, as well as the longevity of that history of the modeling that Howard presented in the introduction. So we have an extensive suite of tools available for decision making. So the geologic model was used to develop the model framework. We actually have divided into 9 model layers that represent the major aquifers and refining layers or aquitards within the basin. Then on the left is just an example showing how we relate the borehole data that we collected from all of the available well data in the region, and made a 3D geologic texture model that we use to estimate aquifer properties. So how permeable an aquifer is, and what its extent is, and how it relates to the cells that are next to it. We have a basic characteristics model, which we again use to take the larger scale climate data that we have. Right, we have just a handful of climate stations and a lot of remotely sensed data that have to be aggregated together into a common framework. And that's what this basic characteristics model does, brings together these very large scale climate data, and then brings them into a scale that's more appropriate for understanding climate within the model. We also have the Salinas Valley watershed model, which simulates the entire watershed that contributes to the Salinas Valley, including the upper valley and in the San Luis Obispo County regions. So it's really, if a drop of water falls within this basin, it ends up in the Salinas River. And we actually have all of those catchments represented here. So a total 574 subcatchments, each one of which has been calibrated to these USGS stream gauges that are all in the red plus signs. And this represents a watershed model for recharge and runoff. So we are gathering information about what's going outside, just outside of the valley that you're normally used to seeing as defining the modeling effort, which is that black line that you may be familiar with. We're actually expand that to include all of the information that's going on in the upper watershed and in the uplands. There are a lot of opportunities to leverage this tool independently to understand sediment and contaminant transport, as well as understanding recharge in the uplands. We've defined 56 different land use types for the Salinas Valley Integrated Model, and these represent major crops that have been grown throughout history in the basin, as well as native vegetation. So upland grasslands, shrublands, woodlands, idle lands, golf courses, quarries, basically a variety of land uses. So it's not just the demands on a specific crop. We're actually considering how upland grasslands use available precipitation to meet their demands, or have groundwater uptake to use and meet their water demands. So it's not just for cultivated lands, it's a holistic understanding of all vegetative and evapotranspiration and all evaporation from any bare lands within the model domain. We use a tiled approach to get at these land uses. So we take all the available land use data that we have for the past 50 years, and we create a set of tiles that we intersect together to create a continuous map, edge to edge, that includes all of the different dominant land use types. And these are based on land use snapshots, aerial photography, agricultural commission data, and then the stakeholder outreach activities that I explained in the previous section. We developed a method that uses that CalPure database, so the California Pesticide Use Reporting Database. That's what the CalPure stands for. And we use this information to enhance the very vague categorization that's often in a lot of land use maps. There are entire regions of the Salinas Valley that in a lot of land use maps are just defined as truck and vegetable crops or irrigated land. And that's insufficient for really estimating the amount of water demand, because a irrigated land with lettuce is a very different thing than an irrigated land with corn. And they're very different timings of planting, they're very different components to land surface, and we want to capture that variability. So what we did to kind of address the known multi-cropping, so multi-cropping is when a single crop or multiple crops are applied in the same kind of parcel over a single year. In order to get at that information, we take kind of 2 snapshots out of every year, and then we take the CalPure data to help understand if it's a vaguely defined land use like irrigated land or truck and vegetable. We use the CalPure data to provide more information about what was actually grown there based on the pesticide data that came out of the CalPure database. That way we can actually have a more refined estimate of the different cropping. And then by taking the 2 snapshots throughout the year, we're really capturing the multi-cropping and the distribution of early and late season planting. Again, the red swath on the right-hand side of this map shown here is really the vague crop categorization I was just talking about, as you can see in 2011. It's all just defined as a unknown type of irrigated land. And definitely on the left, you can see that with the CalPure data, we've actually enhanced that information with a lot more data about what kind of crops those actually were. And that really helps with decision making in the future. We obviously want to check and see how well that was doing against reported data. So we took the Agricultural Commission data for ag production, and we took it and outlined the land use in acres throughout the model domain and compared that to the Agricultural Commission. The green line there is what we would have had we just used a land use map that was provided to us. The red line is actually in the model, and the blue line is what was reported by the county. So what we're able to see here is that we're really getting the major trends and magnitudes of a lot of the major crops, and even information about some crops that actually aren't really even called out specifically in many land use maps, such as tomatoes and peppers. Again, back to the idea of a water balance subregion. So, we have these 10 sub areas of the model that you're used to seeing in a lot of the presentations and reports you've been dealing with. We divided those into 30 balanced subregions so that we can better meet the supply and demand components. That's an example of why we did that. If you see up here in the upper valley, we have this one jurisdictional region was split into 2 different water balance subregions. We did that for a specific purpose because we don't want the wells on this side of the river pumping to meet demands for crops being grown on the other side of the river. So we use the river as a mechanism to kind of split up some of these regions. Now, when we report them, so when the GSA will use some of these data, they'll re-aggregate these 2 water balance subregions together into a common budget for that way it's in a unit that you might recognize. But on the back end, we have a lot more rigor and a lot more detail that we can provide about sub-regional budgets. So the model was calibrated from using all available observations from 1967 to 2014 and updated through water year 2018. So it's almost 104,000 observations of stream flows, stream flow differences, water levels, head differences between wells, reported groundwater pumpage, and reported diversions. And throwing out kind of a nod back to some of the questions that we had, these observations are representative of all the historical climate conditions. So we aren't running this as a drought-only model or as a wet period-only model. We are taking all of the available data, including data representing extreme values, and all of that data is informing the model. we're not excluding anything. We're not cherry picking anything. There's not data that's held at a high. It's all representing the historical condition and all of the historic wet periods and droughts that have existed throughout the calibration period. There are some opportunities for us to refine this. Obviously, as Derek said, this is a modeling tool, and tools are always better when you continue to develop them. And there are some, some other improvements that we can really shoot for that will help things move forward. One is to integrate data from other models. So, we have the Seaside Basin, adjudicated basin that's within the model. There are several ongoing efforts to build seawater intrusion models in the coastal region, making sure that we keep everything aligned as we move forward will benefit everybody, and that will have a consistent answer and a consistent framework so that we don't get in, so we have a better approach and a holistic way of thinking about how we look at water budgets. Another opportunity for refinement is really to add, to get more information about aquifer properties that are distributed throughout the model. So more information about hydraulic connectivity, more understanding about vertical interactions among aquifers to get at what leakage may be happening between the 180 and 400 foot aquifer in the pressure region, as an example. Also, some enhancing our information about stream and aquifer connectivity. One of the major components of SVIHM is to prevent unreasonable stream flow depletion. And we need to understand if there's any stream flow depletion, how the streams are connected to the aquifer, how they may be influenced by shallow groundwater wells near the streams, and understanding that will lead to a much better representation of those things in the model. And the last is really to continue this regional scale coordination and cooperation in the model development that we've been following as this paradigm with the SVBGSA and with Monterey County Water Resource Agency and the county. And that has been to continue to think about sub-regional refinement, improving how we deal with each of these different sub-regions as we get more feedback about how the model is performing in different regions. Get more stakeholder input about the modeling process, and really continue to build consensus and consistency among all these tools. So some things that could help understand agricultural processes a lot better is really if we can get at the representation of agricultural storage ponds in the model. Aerial imagery suggests that there's a substantial storage capacity in a lot of these storage ponds that are in the model domain. And getting at the timing and magnitude of groundwater extraction and surface water use in the model is highly dependent on which water source is being used to meet demand. So that would really improve our ability to understand water balances. If we can actually improve the understanding multi-cropping, so we have the 2 snapshots a year that we're using to represent the important trends. But it could be enhanced much better by having maybe on a sub-regional basis more grower input about multi-cropping and crop types beyond just the aggregated Monterey County reports that we have access to. And then more spatial information about irrigation types. I know that growers out there have been spending a lot of time and effort to upgrade their irrigation systems through time. And we want to be able to understand how those are being distributed, how those are being upgraded, so we can better put that information into the simulation. And then looking at also the off-season production of water. So there's a lot of water use for agriculture that has nothing to do with the actual crop growth cycle and the actual demands from the crop coefficient method. These things include off-season pumping, frost protection, sanitation, or dust management. It'd be good to have an idea of what reported pumpage that we're calibrating to include some of these other sources of water or uses of water. And then we can further enhance this land use data by using remotely sensed data. USGS is developing some national scale tools for this, and there are some ways that we can maybe apply some of that information to help improve the local understanding of water use and water demands. And with that, I'll stop for just a moment to address anything and go back to this question slide and see if see if we can review that together. Or do you want to start opening up for questions while I navigate back to the question slide?
Sure, Wes. I think you could just stop sharing your screen right now, and we're going to take another break here. We've set aside about 10 minutes for questions. So a lot of material again presented. Harrison, will you help me bring those questions forward?
And I can note that there was a question in the chat about what crop year snapshot was used in the model.
Sure. Let me address that but I may not completely understand it. So the model uses land use data for the entire period 1967 through 2014. The snapshots referred to were snapshots to capture the multi-cropping patterns that occur throughout much of the Salinas Valley for a number of crops. I'm not sure if that answers the specific question though. So if it doesn't, raise your hand, we'll try and get the answer for you.
Bill Light has his hand raised.
Yeah, thank you, Harrison. Yeah, I missed out on the last time. Sorry for the silence. I was in transition between modes here. Just a few, some quick questions. The commodities, the two snapshots, are those pesticide use reports that you're talking about that are twice a year looked at and then sort of extrapolated across the whole valley?
Basically, that's it, Bill, but I want to see if Dr. Henson has anything he'd like to expound on.
Yeah, let me, I guess, clarify a little bit more. So we have two land use maps per year in the model. And the early season and late season are kind of what those two maps are trying to capture. And other than the it's like stable or hardened crops or crop things they're infrequently changed or only change on an annual basis, those are kept fixed, right? So you're not gonna take an orchard and then have that same orchard be a different land use in the second period, right? But we have that information is being done twice a year, and the only part that's being updated with the CalPure data is just an information about how the distribution of, say, broccoli or lettuce have changed from early to late season throughout the basin as multi-cropping has been implemented. And these are based on the multi-year snapshots. So, right, we often have land use data, but they're usually done on a 5 or 10 year recurrence frequency. They're representative of a multiple years of data. And this information is now giving us a much more high frequency to address and put that information in the model. And we just get that by enhancing it with the CalPure data. Does that help explain your question?
That's fine. Yeah, I think that may get at the question that was asked on the chat too. What do you have the whole commodity mix for the valley, or was it just the 4 you showed up there?
Oh yeah, that was just 4 I used for purposes of explanation.
No,
there are 56 crop types or 56 land use types, and I think 24 different crop types. It'd just be too inundating to actually show all of those. And we don't actually have a lot of those commodities even reported in the agricultural reports. The other challenge there is those reports are for the whole county, and trying to relate that back down to the individual sub areas as a portion where the stakeholder input would be really helpful.
You have the river dividing these sub areas. And maybe I'll ask Howard this question because Dr. Henson, I don't know if you'll know the answer to this question. Are there any wells set up on one side of the river that are pumping to the other side of the river? Do you know of any wells that are doing that, or any landowners that are doing that?
I'm not aware of that.
I wasn't either. So I was. It's curious if that was it. I was going to ask about contiguous ground, but everywhere I've ever driven, most places at least, you have ranches on one side of the river, you have ranches on the other side. You generally don't have a pipe going across the river.
Mr. Knight,
Don't need one. Yeah.
We'd like to move. We'll come back to you, but I want to give everyone a chance here.
I thought we had 5 minutes apiece. I thought that was the ground rules. Okay. Or just 5 minutes a question.
We'll come back to you, Mr. Knight.
All right.
Harrison, anyone else?
Yeah, we have Nancy Isaacson and then John Bramers.
Okay.
Thank you. Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are, Nancy. Good afternoon.
Sorry, I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand. So I think you addressed this, but I just wanted to clarify or confirm that the land use package is land use for a specific year. And is that year and that land use package then carried forward into the future as static? In other words, it's assumed that the land use that existed, I think it's 2014, that is carried forward into the future, and you haven't addressed any potential changes.
On the at this time, the historical model is calibrated between 1967 and 2014, but we have extended the hydrologic period of the model a few more years, and we use that primarily in the operational model. But for a historical model, we would go back to what was occurring as best we can represent it on the ground at the time.
For the land use too, so the land use is dynamic.
The land use would be dynamic in the historical model. That is correct.
Okay. And you haven't talked about the operational yet, so maybe I need to ask a question there.
We're certainly going to get there. Thank you, Nancy. John?
Nancy asked the question and I'll wait for the next model. Thank you.
Okay. I think, Harrison, are there any other questions out there or comments? We have more time here. We can circle back to Mr. Light.
No other raised hands, Howard.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for patience, Bill.
Oh, hey, no worries. Hey, everybody jump in. I hate being a one-man band. You know that, Howard. More voices, more eyeballs is better. Can this, and this may be a question to Derek, can we use this model to actually model to the Bulletin 118 subbasins? Because aren't we going to try to model and balance our subbasins first and then determine how the interconnectivity to the other subbasins to determine whether or not our balanced plan as we see it in the, say, the upper valley would conflict with other people's plans? Can we do it? Can we do it down to our actual subbasin, which I think we've had some issues with wells and whatnot?
Yeah, Mr. Leipen, the short answer is yes, we can. As Dr. Hinson pointed out, the output from the model, from each model cell can be combined into different groups of model cells. So we can take the output, and we are doing that, to look at just to basically cookie cutter out each of the Bulletin 118 subbasins and say what's happening in that subbasin. We do have that ability and we are doing it, yes.
Thank you. And this one last question, I promise. There's talk about this stream aquifer connectivity. And as I recall, our council, Mr. Les Gerard, had kind of said that that was a third rail that we really didn't want to touch. Yet this seems this model is looking at that and may hold us to a standard. Is that the case from a legal standpoint?
Are you asking for a legal opinion, Mr. Light?
Well, I mentioned our counsel, Mr. Gerard. So
Yes.
Derek, I'm not going to put that one on you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're free. You're free and clear.
I would ask Mr. Franklin or Mr. Williams to show their license to practice law before letting them answer that question. Bill,
Yeah.
I'm happy to try to answer to the extent I can. Could you repeat the question, Bill?
Well, there was some talk towards the end of this particular slot of the presentation, and maybe Dr. Henson can pull up that slide. It talks about better understanding of stream aquifer connectivity. I know that's one of our undesirable results we need to at least monitor and take care of. But how deep is this model going to get us into stream aquifer connectivity and potential underflow issues? And then we open up U.S. federal patents on rights to water that maybe predate the formation of the state of California. So I'm just asking the question.
Well, I think it's, I don't want to speak for the scientists on the call, but the GSA has no jurisdiction over water rights, and So what you're asking though is, will the model demonstrate aspects of the connectivity between groundwater and surface water that implicate water rights? At least that's how I interpret it.
Yeah, you're on the right. You're on the same path. I'm kind of
And I, I think, I think it's appropriate for the model to describe the conditions that it's modeling. The legal conclusions that can be drawn from that, the GSA should stay away from.
Thank you. I won't make you show your card either, Les.
I think we have time for another question. Harrison, if there's someone else out there.
Yeah, we have Janet Brennan, and then I don't know if you can see the chat, Howard, but Christopher Bunn put in a few questions in the chat if you want to look at those as well.
Sure, and so Chris, I'm seeing you're asking here, how long does it take to run the model and the cost? I haven't done a cost estimate recently, but once the model is configured and you push the button to run, it takes about 16 hours for all the computations to occur. That'll improve over time, but that's about the processing time now. I'll have to get back to you on the costs for a single model run, because it depends on the model run. What are you trying to configure? Most of the cost there is in the configuration of the model. And then another cost that's often overlooked with these models and modeling projects is the cost of analyzing the data. Hundreds and hundreds, thousands of data points, hundreds of data files come out of these models. And it's not a small effort to analyze all that data. And with that, I will take another question, Harrison, from the audience, and then we'll try and capture in the chat what's left.
Okay, next is Janet Brennan.
Yes, Ms. Brenham.
I have no question. Thank you.
Okay. So we're doing pretty good, keeping on time. We're on our schedule. We're a little bit behind, but I think we're still pretty good. We're going to move into the next portion of the agenda. Dr. Henson's going to continue talking with us about the construction now of the Salinas Valley operational model, and he'll also be joined in that conversation by other members of the team. So Wes, it's back to you.
All right, just one moment, let me share the screen again. All right, so just to loop back around on some of the items here. So we talked about the data gaps in the integrated hydrological model. We have only updated the model through water year 2018, so 20 through 2020 is not actually set up yet. That we're working on an agreement to get that updated, but right now it's only through water year 2018. No, going back to the presentation. Let's get the early slides again. All right, so the operational model, right? Everyone's curious about this one. It's you can think of it as the child of the Salinas model. It does things very, very similar. It has a lot of the same components, a lot of the same rigor of everything that went into the integrated model over the historical period. Has been used to develop this model as a tool to really to look at different scenarios, to look at different water supply projects, to look at and forecast into the future. Because we were able to take and codify the important components that humans are making decisions about according to the current regulatory and water rights structure, we're able to take and now push that as an opportunity to even evaluate not just a historical period to today, but a forecast period can be evaluated. And so that's being used in several different studies, and it's very much of high interest. But I didn't want to kind of indicate here that there are distinct differences. It is mostly the same as far as the underlying structure and the properties, et cetera, but there are some significant differences, which I'll highlight as we go through the presentation. So the operational model, the SVOM, is a baseline model. And you may ask, what's a baseline model? Well, a baseline model is a model that kind of helps you define a hypothetical baseline condition, right? Because throughout the historical period, throughout the entire history within the Salinas Valley, right, climate and land use have changed. There's been droughts, there's been wet years, there's been, you know, periodicity of a lot of different components. There's been socioeconomic conditions and growth of different communities. There's been changes in what's been grown, right? We're no longer producing sugar beets in the same way that they were done before, right? There's a lot of things that have changed, and also water supply projects have come into place, right? The Castroville Seawater Improvement Program, the reservoir itself. I mean, there's a lot of things that have come on board since the beginning of the model simulation that have been staggered throughout the simulation. So, you know, if you're trying to understand the particular benefit or drawback of a certain decision you might want to make, well, it's kind of hard to separate has the groundwater system, which has a lower response to changes on the surface. It does respond, but climate and surface changes propagate to the groundwater system usually a little bit slower than say a river system that's draining after a flood. There's a slower response time. And how do you separate the lag and response time from the actual effect of a project? Well, how we do that is we take up and create a hypothetical baseline model. So again, the Salinas Valley operational model is a hypothetical model based on the historical climate. So we take all of the same climate that was put into the integrated model for the historical period, but we fix conditions for the historical model, for the historical baseline model. We fix the conditions to 2014 land use, just making the assumption that the projects that are sized and made today, that are representing water demands, that are meant to meet the water demands of today and effects of today's aquifer, would be best represented by the extent of irrigated lands that exists today. So we have then also all the implemented projects that have water supply projects that have been implemented in the basin are implemented from day one in the model, as well as the land use being fixed at current conditions from day one of the model. And again, the point of this is to provide a baseline condition. So that's this white line on the little graph to the right saying, look, this is what if this, in this hypothetical world, this is what I can say is the zero line. Now I can run simulations like the GSA is doing for understanding different potential strategies for mitigating groundwater overdraft, or for perhaps building an interlake tunnel between two reservoirs to understand and maybe use their joint capacity to provide more water supply. Or a variety of different options, looking at different flow prescription options with national marine fisheries. All of these things are great things that a baseline model is meant to do. But the budgets and everything that are coming out of it are going to be different from the historical model and are not the historical model. But you still get a really great baseline for which to compare the benefits or drawbacks or potential magnitudes of responses in this system against each other fairly. And that's the point of this baseline model. It's also really useful for helping to scope project size. So this was developed specifically for the purpose of the initial application to evaluate the proposed interlake tunnel operation. And that is the tunnel to link both the Lake San Antonio and Lake Nacimiento into a combined reservoir system. And that was the original impetus for kind of the initial setup of the operational model, but its value for a lot of the other projects is very well known, which is why there's a lot of interest in it. And it's a great tool for understanding and evaluating different projects. Now, it inherits, again, aquifer properties and crops, information from crops that have been from the historical model, so there's consistency there. Again, the historical climate, including all of the extremes and all the things, but 2014 land use, and then includes all the current projects operating from the beginning. So the Castroville Seawater Intrusion Project, the Salinas River Diversion Facility, and then again, it uses all the current reservoir operations and adheres to the flow prescription and water rights. It just does it inside the model so that we don't have to sit there like, you know, in the real world, right? There's a real person up there controlling the gate. There's a real person following the rules. There's a real, all these things. The model has to know how to do that. And that's what the operational component that's in the surface water operations module, that's what that's providing for the modeling framework. And the operations module takes the rules, the already published, already accepted rules for reservoir operation based on water year type, based on reservoir storage, based on flow triggers and flow targets for the fish passage and for all the other water rights expectations for the reservoir. On the right is one of the flow charts showing how the logic kind of flow for how block flow reservoir releases are controlled. And these are just implemented as logic files with the model. Again, they're evaluated internally based on the internal, so the model knows what the flow is at SPOC gauge. The model knows what the flow is at the release gauge. The model knows what the flow is at the Soledad gauge. And so it's using that information to help constrain the reservoir releases to meet those needs. And then it's written in human readable text files. Now, granted, there is a learning curve in understanding the layout of them, because it's logic, as you can see here, is quite extensive. Sifting through that is definitely it takes a moment to kind of walk through the files, but the logic is just this logic flowgram you have here, just written out in text files. Those text files, as the GSA has done with Wood, has been to modify some of those logic things to evaluate potential scenarios for groundwater sustainability projects, or for future climate change, or for whatever other things that need to be evaluated with potential change in logic. But it's all transparent. It's all external to the model as far as the configuration of them, and it's completely transparent, right? There's no hiding what logic is going on there. It's all in there, and it's all open and ready to, this is just codifying the data that is already public knowledge. So these data are available upon request. So we can share these information, and they're not sensitive. We can share any information about what the operational model is doing and how it's making decisions. That way, there's no kind of wondering, well, how are they operating the model? Are they doing it fairly? Are they doing what they're supposed to do? They're following the logic that's associated with the regulatory and legal framework that we're all operating with. So I just want to talk briefly about what the next steps are of this. And I'm not sure if this is actually after break or whether I should stop here for questions.
Go ahead and continue, Wes.
All right. So all these tools are related to each other. And that is both wonderful, and then also has challenges with respect to publishing them all at the same time, because they all have to be kicked down the road. They can't be kicked down the road at the same time. So we have the technical review right now is occurring for the Salinas Valley Integrated Hydrological Model. And we'll go into specialist review to the USGS review process this coming winter. And then we'll start writing the operational model report, which will be a report specifically describing the baseline model implementation of the operational model. And then we have an editorial review and specialist review of those products, and then with an aim of getting this out by next summer, and publication of the operational model shortly thereafter. Now, a lot of these items are points in a process that is a quite extensive process that I don't have ultimate control over every component of, but this is our best estimate of the timeline of model publication. In the interim, there are several non-sensitive, that are model input data sets that can be shared to facilitate any other questions that you may have. I also want to highlight another related study that we're working on, which is the Salinas Carmel River Basin Study. It's a partnership with U.S. Bureau of Reclamation and with the San Luis Obispo County Public Works, Monterey County, and Monterey Peninsula Water Management District. And it combines several hydrologic models within this region shown on the left in the study region, and subjects all of these models to the same kind of boundaries or changes or scenarios to understand in a regional context what the water supply vulnerability might be over the next century, provide insights into potential strategies for addressing any potential water supply shortfalls, and then allows drilling down into these specific subregions to understand what's going on in each of those regions and how each of those independent regions may also be able to respond to some of these changes. To address that, these models, including a version of the Salinas Valley operational model, are subjected to these future conditions. So there are 6 climate forecasts to 2100. There are 3 socioeconomic growth projections to 2100, and that includes both a land use change component as well as a population growth component. And then a water supply strategy portfolio. So looking at alternate water supplies, conservation strategies, new water supplies, desalination, a bunch of different projects to kind of understand which water supply projects have the best chance at reducing any potential vulnerabilities over the next century. So it's a really great study to be involved with, to think about holistically how we're managing water resources. And really interesting to see also the Salinas Valley operational model as being such a great component of this, and will provide a lot of really great feedback that will help enhance further development efforts for the groundwater sustainability planning and for just regional water resource sustainability. Also, as part of this, we've been collaborating with Monterey County and Monterey County Water Resource Agency for several years now, and there's really been a lot of substantial contributions to the actual software itself that that's come out of this process that we're very grateful for. In testing this bed, we've really been working together as partners, research partners, in developing this operational component and developing this integrated modeling tool, and using Salinas as a test bed to understand how we can better make models that are complex but yet can be disaggregated to the pieces that are really needed to really make good water management decisions. And that CalPure method that I described earlier, I'm working right now with DWR, and my team's actually going to be developing out that method to test it out for the entire state. So this is really, this test bed has provided a lot of opportunity that will provide far-reaching benefits to the rest of the state even. And then we also have a lot of coordination with the Salinas Valley Basin GSA in this process too, and with the related efforts in the basin. So it's not just this one project, it's really this suite of projects is feeding back into this really great regional scale collaboration that we'd like to bring more partners into. We'd like to build out, and we'd like to continue to develop in this kind of way where we are moving together to build consensus together using a set of tools that we help build and refine together.
Thank you, Dr. Henson. We're going to hold off questions now until the end. We're going to try and save as much time as we can at the end of this next and final section of the workshop. It's going to be turning it back to Mr. Derek Williams and his staff to talk about some historical and current water budgets and sustainabilities within the model. Some of the applications currently utilized by the SVPGSA. Mr. Williams?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Franklin. As I mentioned at the beginning, the model is, and as Dr. Hinson talked about, this is kind of an integrated model for many aspects of water management in the Valley, but we are using these models specifically for GSP development and then for GSP implementation. And I'm actually going to turn this over now to my colleague, Stefan Shore. And Stefan's going to go through the next series of slides and talk about how we are taking the data out of the model and using it in the GSP. Stefan?
Wes, you can stop sharing your screen. I can just do it on my end if you'd like. So I just talk.
Stefan, you sound like you're talking from a long way away there.
Really?
Try.
Boy, I'm not quite sure.
Try checking your. Oh,
there
it is. All right.
Sorry about that. Okay, so we want to talk a little bit about the applications of the SVIHM and how we're using it for the GSP. And you might remember we had a workshop on the water budgets, and we presented these lots of various complex diagrams. And here's showing one that is showing the various different complexities of the model. Dr. or West
Stefan,
a
I'm
lot
not
about.
sure we're seeing the right screen of yours.
Oh,
Do
really?
you think? Yeah. Do you think that you're showing the diagram? You're actually showing a picture that says application of the SVIHM and SVOM.
Well, there.
How is this? PowerPoint status. You're just at the slides. Go to slideshow.
Let's see.
You should transfer your display solely to your exterior. I think we're getting your second work area.
Ah, okay. Yeah, I think you're right.
I should say expanded work area. I don't think it's a second one. You can have multiples, but
how is this?
expanded.
Do you see it now?
There, now we see it. Yes.
Bingo.
Okay. Sorry about that. I apologize. Okay, so we're talking about this diagram here. You should be seeing lots of arrows and green and blue, talking about the land system, the surface water system, and the groundwater system. And I just wanted to flash this up really quick to remind you of all what we talked about in our March workshop with the water budgets, and how complicated the water budgets can be. And I think Wes touched on that about the interactions that go on and the utilities of the models for that. So the benefits of using these models really is for that integration of the different types of data and all the different models that can be used to produce a single water budget. And that water budget would be internally consistent. And so we heard a lot about today about the different types of data, the precipitation, the vegetation, crops, pumping, diversions of various different stream flows and those kind of things. And then all the models that feed into these SVIHM, and it really makes it more of a dynamic and integrated model to be able to use. And that's the water budget is already internally consistent within the model itself. And then because of it's consistent, we can produce consistent water budgets for the subbasins. So we can use that cookie cutter approach that Derek mentioned, and I'll show a little bit in the next couple of slides, that we can easily carve out subbasin water budgets and be able to evaluate the impacts of those within the subbasin and within adjacent subbasins. Then we're able to assess the impacts of various different programs and projects in more of a holistic manner. Again, we can see if a project in one basin, how it might have an impact within the basin and also to adjacent basins. And then another benefit really for the SVOM is as Wes was pointing out, that it's set up for estimating future pumping and also the reservoir rules. And that's already set up, automated, and tested. So that really makes it for a good tool for us for the GSA to move forward on some of the planning for the GSP purposes. So talk a little bit about these zones. We've been hearing a lot about them, and we've seen this figure before. So the water budgets are developed for each subbasin of the GSP by grouping these model results by zones. Basically, that's the aggregation that Wes was talking, taking cell by cell information and grouping it into each of these zones or areas. And here we're showing on the right a map of all the subbasins boundaries within the Salinas Valley basin. And what's not showing here also, for example, for Forebay, is not showing the management area within the Forebay basin, which that is an additional zone where we can carve out and evaluate separately. So these are divided into the zones. They represent these subbasins, these management areas, or other areas of interest that we want to look at. And then each of model grid cell is assigned that zone number, and then we can compile that in, as what Wes was talking about. And what the GSA, what Montgomery & Associates is doing, has taken the model results are extracted from these various different model output files, and we're processing them for each of these zones based on the zone number to put it into more of an understandable sense. So we can understand it, so you all, the stakeholders, can understand it, and the public. And so all that information, it's a huge amount of information, big data files. We process, we prepared tools to be able to handle all this different types of data and group them and tabulate them, and then do some QA, QC various different processes. And here's the end results. And this is just an example of a historical water budget for the Forebay subbasin. And here on the left, it shows the surface water budget. On the right is the groundwater budget. And each one of those bars represents the inflow or outflow component that we've extracted from the model and compiled and processed it into just for this Forebay, for example. And the groundwater budget, the same thing. We show each of the inflows and the outflow components, but we also can show the change of storage. And these are annual values. And so we can see the change of storage through time. And these type of plots are helping us to evaluate various different aspects and questions that come up with the GSPs. One thing that these plots also show that we're showing in those chapters is the water year classification is showing kind of those shades in the background. So you can look at these plots and see how was the groundwater budget impacted by the drought of, in the late 1980s, early 1990s. You can see these various different responses from year to year. So this is just an example. Each one of the subbasins was evaluated and produced a series of these types of maps. And one thing, we take the historical information and we pretty much extract that out from the SVIHM, but for the SVOM, as Wes was indicating, we did make some changes to be able to move forward on some of the evaluations. And one of those changes is the climate change. And we ran simulations for the 2030 and 2070 climate change. And I was going to let Matt Bailey from Wood Group talk about how that was done briefly.
Yes, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So the Sigma legislation mandates that part of groundwater sustainability planning is to look at conditions under a couple different sets of climate change conditions. And those are meant to be representative of 2030 and 2070 sort of central tendency climate projections. DWR provides data for GSAs to be able to do that analysis. And what they provide is the outputs from another model called the VIC model. This model, the outputs that they provide are what they call change factors. And that's basically sort of a percentage up or down change from 1995 conditions, I believe, that are meant to be representative of either 2030 conditions or 2070 conditions. Somewhat confusingly, the climate change analyses that we do not utilize a continuous time series of climate conditions. For example, climate projections from now until 2070. Instead, they produce a set of realistic climate time series, for example, precip or reference ET, that are all meant to be representative of 2030 conditions, which is a little bit hard to wrap one's mind around. So they provide these data in a gridded format that's downscaled from global models. Those data can be overlaid onto our model grid to come up with a time series of perturbations for each cell in our model grid, and those can then be multiplied by the historical time series that we're using for the SVIHM and the SVOM to come up with a set of representative 2030 climate data and a set of representative 2070 climate data for each cell in the model grid. So those change factors are simply multiplied by the historical climate time series that we're using for the baseline model. Similarly, the DWR makes available a set of change factors for stream flow as well. So this is based on the VIC, and it's a change factor that's meant to represent conditions of unimpaired stream flow under 2030 and 2070 climate. Of course, stream flow impairment is rather a big deal in this basin, but all of the inflow along streams at the edges of the model are of course unimpaired, other than that coming out in Nacimiento and San Antonio reservoirs, and as well coming in from Paso Robles. So the change factors that DWR supplies are relevant for creating stream flow along the edges of the model. The last component in our climate change approach is accounting for sea level rise. So we have an assumption of 15 centimeters of sea level rise in our 2030 climate condition model, and an assumption of 45 centimeters in our 2070 climate condition model. And that's based on projections for this segment of the California coast. That's the very brief overview of how we've tried to incorporate climate change into our model. This is a different approach from what the USGS is taking with the Basins Project, for example. But it checks the boxes for the groundwater sustainability planning and uses the DWR tools that have been provided for that.
Good, thanks, Matt. And I should add here that we have this baseline future projections model, which is just the SVOM from the USGS, and then we have these climate change scenarios. So we do have kind of three flavors in a sense of the no projects, and then we simulate using that for the projects as well. I'll talk about that next. So we use these models to estimate the sustainable yield as well. The sustainable yield is calculated using the simulated results from SVIHM and the SVOM. So the historical and current sustainable yield estimates are from the SVIHM, and then the future are from the SVOM. And those involve the groundwater pumping, change in groundwater storage, and seawater intrusion storage loss. We did find that we had to make some adjustments to the pumping on some of the subbasins, that there was some discrepancy between the simulated groundwater pumping and the GEMS database. So post-processing also included to making these adjustments to the pumping data, and then adjusting the sustainable yield accordingly. And for certain areas, a range of sustainable yields is estimated to address some of these uncertainties in the model results. Now for the projects, as we were talking about before, certain potential projects are simulated using the SVOM, and that's where we would make some of these modifications to the USGS version. For example, adding in an additional diversion or pumping wells, those type of things for various different requirements for the projects. And the SVOM has been very important to use, or a benefit for use, because it's an integrated structure, and it allows for the holistic assessment of these impacts of a project within the basin, and also any impacts on any other basins in the model area. So these results are the project simulation results are evaluated as basically the differential between the project simulation and the baseline simulation. So we're looking at the changes between the simulation with the projects and then what it was without the project. So we're looking at the differences on that. These model simulations are used to gain an understanding of these benefits. However, the projects are conceptual still, and we're needing to further refine them in order to assess do a benefits assessment for them. So some of the limitations, uncertainty, we talked about already, kind of in broad terms. One of the things that we adjusted was the pumping. And for example, in Langley subbasin, we added in the domestic pumping. The de minimis pumping overall in general is not included in the SVIHM or the SVOM. It's considered to be very small in the basin, so it was just not simulated. But however, in the Langley aquifer subbasin, domestic pumping does account for a substantial portion of that total pumping. So we adjusted the model results, the simulated pumping, to add in the domestic pumping for that. And then for that, we also adjusted some of the other components like groundwater storage to try to account for that uncertainty within that particular subbasin. Yeah, that's all we have for using the using the SVOM and SVIHM for the water budgets.
Thank you.
Move on to questions.
I appreciate the presentation. So we're at about, we have about 15 minutes more. We'd like to take at least 10 minutes of that, as much as we can, to address any of your questions. I saw a question in the chat by Mr. Light asking what water is being taken out of the basin. Specifically, we're outside of Zone 2C. So there are outflows from the model, outflows to the ocean, outflows through evaporation, evapotranspiration, but we currently do not have configured any projects within the model that remove water from the basin, if that was your question, Mr. Light.
And no well owners that you know of that are moving water outside of Zone 2C?
None that I'm aware of, Mr. Light. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
So I'm going to utilize Harrison again to help me out here.
Yeah, we have. Go ahead, Emily.
Sorry, I also just wanted to point out there's a few other questions above Bill's question in the chat as well. So maybe while Harrison goes out.
Sure. So I tried, that's Mr. Bunn's question. I tried to address part of it, Chris. How does the model compensate when water from within the basin boundaries is used outside the basin boundaries? We don't do that. As I answered Mr. Leip's question, we don't have anything configured within the model that removes water as a project from the basin. I'm not sure if I'm getting at that exactly what you're asking. If you're still out there, please feel free to raise your hand and help me out a little more. I see you've done that. So Harrison, do we have someone lined up?
Well, Chris Bunn's raised his hand if you want to have him respond.
Sure, we'll go right to Chris.
Yeah,
Mr. Bunn.
Yeah, sorry, I kind of dumped a whole bunch of questions in there at one go. And it's back to the budget question. It'd be great if we could just get kind of a rough theoretical idea of what a sample budget would look like. And we wouldn't hold you to the numbers, of course, but just some numbers and time so we could wrap our brains around that for future benefit. And then as far as water being pumped in the basin and being used outside the basin, the valley map on the GSA website itself, it shows a significant amount of irrigated acreage that's just outside of the DWR boundary lines. And so it's pretty clear that several hundreds, if not more, of irrigated acreage is being watered by water from inside the basin. So it'd be good to see how the model is going to compensate for that, because it'd be nice to have the model be as honest as it can be in what it's looking at. But then to the other questions, if this is more of a legal question, I guess for Les, but if I understood Dr. Henson's presentation correctly, it sounds like the model can be used to run simulations for any given water cell in the basin. And if that's true, wouldn't that theoretically open the door to parcel-specific challenges to regional benefit assessments? i.e., if you can calculate down to a specific water cell, then couldn't you use that as a basis to challenge the benefit assessment?
In theory, Chris, I think that's true, but I think the statute of limitations to challenge the approval of the engineer's report and the benefit assessments is long past. So I don't think going forward, this probably could use some more research. I don't think going forward, somebody could challenge the levying of the assessment originally for the Salinas Valley Water Project or others, but to the extent that the model could get that much detail or that much specificity, it could be used to address benefits for a different project.
For the future, yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm not pulling out my law degree, but I'm also going to respond here with regard to the precision versus accuracy of analysis we do. Certainly you can go to almost unlimited precision when you define these model cells. You could make them 1 foot by 1 foot or 6 acres square, which is more where we're at here. But that doesn't make that single cell particularly accurate to that location on the ground. It goes to the resolution of the data. So I'm going to leave it at that because the rest of it probably does get into needing a law license. I do want to respond to your question, Mr. Bunn, about pumping outside the basin or pumping in the basin and moving water outside the basin. That again might verge on a legal question, but with regard to this model, any pumping that's occurring in the basin is captured, but the boundaries of this model adhere to the boundaries of the agency's Zone 2A. The active cells in this model do not necessarily cover the entirety of the GSA's basin delineations. But Mr. Derek Williams and his team is doing a good job compensating for that. With regard to water budgets, absolutely, I think it's a good idea to come up with some type of schematic. We can't necessarily do it right now, but we come up with some kind of schematic for water budgets from the model, something that a general lay person would be able to understand.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. And just last question, sorry, this is it. I'll shut up. Is the vegetation, the riparian channels being treated as a crop type? Or if not, how's it being calculated for water consumption?
Riparian corridor is calculated as a land use type or a crop type. It's synonymous.
Okay, great, thanks.
Harrison?
Janet had her hand raised, but then she put her question in the chat. So, do you want me to read it out loud, or can you see it, Howard?
I can see it. How does the model address increased storm intensity under the climate change assumptions? And I'm going to pass that on to either Mr. Bailey or Mr. Shore. Whoever feels like they want to take a shot at that one. Matt.
Yeah, I can take an attempt to answer that. I'm afraid I won't have too much of an answer. It's addressed to the extent that DWR's VIC model has addressed it. And that puts out change factors that are produced on a monthly basis. And our model, the SVOM, is also using streamflow inputs that are input on a monthly basis. So to a great extent, storms themselves will not have the same impact on inputs to the model as they may in real life. Streamflow inputs are not going to be nearly as flashy as storms are, and therefore with a changing climate where you might expect storms to become more flashy, that wouldn't necessarily be reflected strongly in this model, which has a longer time discretization. I don't know offhand if the VIC that these inputs are based on is run on a shorter time step, which then might handle the intensification of storms or not.
Harrison, do we have any other questions?
Next, we have Ann Myrie.
Good afternoon, Ann.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the presentation today. I have a little different question. I realize the most recent update is 2018. Subsequently, the Upper Valley has expanded greatly with the addition of a portion of the Paso Robles Basin. And so I know that's not in this study with the last review in 2018. But I'm wondering if you're going to be accommodating that area in this modeling in the future. I realize, well, it's a significant area of property. It's not maybe a significant area of water use. The Big Sandy, just a few hundred irrigated acres in Hames Valley, and we probably have no authority over Camp Roberts. But I'm just curious.
That's a good question, Ann, but I'm going to defer it to the SVBGSA to address that question.
Okay.
Yeah, Ms. Myrie, I'll take
it.
it, Ms. Myrie, and that is an excellent question. And I think everything you said is absolutely correct. It is a significant area of land. It does not have a lot of water use currently, so we're able to compensate our water budgets for it without a lot of effort because there isn't a lot of water use. However, it is in our plan to expand the groundwater portion of the model into that area because it is part of the basin. As Mr. Henson, as Dr. Henson pointed out, the rainfall runoff portion of the model, the watershed portion of the model already covers that area. It's just the groundwater portion we would have to expand. And the short answer is yes, we plan on expanding it into there. It won't be before the GSPs are released, but it is in our plan to do it.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Derek. So we're really tight on time now to wrap up this meeting. Harrison, how many more questions do we have out there? And do we have a quick one?
3 more raised hands.
I'm going to have to defer to Emily. Emily, we're down to the last 2 or 3 minutes. I would certainly want to encourage that if we can't go over, we capture any questions you might have. But Emily, I'm going to defer to you now.
Yes, I will echo that. Let's just squeeze in the last few questions. We are not technically having a meeting. There was no quorums present, so we don't need to do the final few agenda items. So let's just move right into, I think Justine Massey was up next.
Thanks. So I wanted to ask again about domestic wells and how they might be incorporated into this model going forward, which, you know, it's such an impressive model, incorporates so many different aspects of how water moves throughout the basin. And so in light of DWR's recommendation in the determination letter for the GSA to inventory and better define the location of active wells in the basin and document known impacts to drinking water users caused by groundwater management in subsequent annual reports and periodic updates. I'm just interested in you know, how that might look within this model. Does that look like showing, you know, plotting the domestic wells and their depths and comparing to groundwater levels? Would it include the contaminant plumes? Like, how could that look? And has the GSA discussed integrating those factors?
Mr. Williams, the key word there was GSA.
Yeah, I caught that. Yeah, Ms. Massey. Probably we do need to, especially in certain parts of the basin, start looking at what the extractions by domestic wells are. Right now we're doing it outside the model. We're saying this is the amount of pumping we think is happening in this part of the basin, say the Langley subbasin, and then we're adding in domestic wells. It will be beneficial for us in the future to add the domestic wells explicitly, but you are adding a lot of data within most of the valley with very little impact on the model by doing that. So it is a data intensive job that in most of the model is going to have very little impact. As you pointed out, DWR would like us to do this, and we have every intent of doing this and working with you, working with DWR, and working with everybody to make sure we understand how how domestic wells influence the groundwater conditions and how they're impacted by groundwater conditions. However, that will only probably be for water levels. You asked about contaminant transport and plumes. This model right now is not being set up for that. That would be another big leap, and we don't have plans to do that right now. If there was a request, if there was a real desire that we had to do contaminant transport modeling, it would probably be a different tool than this one.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. And of course, you know, on our end at Community Water Center, we're especially concerned with how the model shows what impacts would be. And I would definitely like to talk about what other models could be used to anticipate impacts from groundwater quality. So thank you.
So with that, it's officially 3 o'clock now. So I see Bob Abrams and Bill Leip have outstanding questions. So I'm hoping that you two can email me those questions and we'll try to tackle them offline.
How do we make sure the public actually sees all of these questions so that it's fully transparent to everyone what's been asked and what's been answered?
You mean the questions, the emailed questions after this meeting?
Yeah.
Okay. I can post that with the meeting materials.
I think it should go to the distribution list and it should go on the archive somewhere on the website as additional. I think you're capturing all these comments anyway. I think maybe we could just add it to the spreadsheet that you have currently. Right? You could just add it as this date and this particular workshop meeting.
So we are going to be posting the Zoom recording as usual on our website. We'll also have the slides posted as a PDF. So that's how that will be documented. If we have direct, I can't commit to posting all questions ever asked about the model. But for your questions and Bob questions that we don't have time for right now, if you email me those, I'll add those to the meeting materials that we post.
Appreciate that.
My pleasure.
I'd like to ask them, but if we got to go, we got to go.
It's just 3 o'clock and I want to respect everybody's time. So sorry about that. We tried to cram in a lot of information in 2 hours and
you sure did. You sure did.
We had time.
You absolutely did all of that. You did. So thank you.
I just want to point out that I posted a question to the chat about 25 minutes ago, and I guess you guys didn't see it.
Bob, sorry about that. Did not see that.
Bob, I still don't see your question on the chat.
You might have sent it directly to Emily or something.
So
no,
please.
I sent it to
all panelists, and I hit return at the end of my typing. And okay, well, I'll email it to you unless you want to take it now.
Yeah, I don't see it in my chat still, Bob. So please email me directly.
Okay.
Okay. So with that, like I mentioned, we never had a quorum of any specific subbasin committees, and so with that, just like to thank all of our presenters so much for putting together such a wealth of information in such a short period of time, and thank you for all of you that took time out of your day to join us. Really appreciate it. And with that, the meeting is adjourned.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
The workshop
nice
is
day.
adjourned.